welcome everyone. My name is Dimitris. I'm a professor of Byzantine history at the Department of Humanities at Simon Fraser University, and I'll be hosting today's event. We're very thankful that you're joining us for the final installment of this fall series, of this fall seminar series hosted by the Stavros Foundation Center for Hellenic Studies here at Simon Fraser University. Each year, we invite a mix of established international scholars and emerging researchers working in different aspects of Hellenic studies, broadly conceived, to present their research on a range of fields from archaeology and classics to Byzantine, Ottoman, and modern Greek history, literature, and culture. Before we begin, I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that this event is taking place at Simon Fraser University on Burnaby Mountain, on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Coquitlam peoples. Now, before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to remind everyone that this webinar is being recorded. If you have questions or concerns about SFU's Zoom privacy and security guidelines, I would ask you to visit SFU's IT website. As this is a hybrid event, we ask our online audience to send us a message in the Q&A if you face any significant problems hearing the presentation. If for some reason the sound quality is poor and cannot be resolved, you should know that the event is recorded, so there will be an available version of this talk for consultation at a later stage. The in-person audience, please ensure that you speak loudly when it comes to asking your questions, and otherwise remain as discreet and quiet as possible during the presentation. Now, today I'm pleased to present Ethan Schmidt. Ethan is a first-year doctoral student at Simon Fraser University under my supervision. His research focuses on culture, literature, and urban space in medieval Byzantium, and his dissertation will address, we'll see, there's time for that, but that's the aspiration at the moment, the place of ekphrastic texts on cities and cityscapes in the changing 12th century Byzantine urban culture and society at large. Ethan received his undergraduate degree in medieval history from the University of St. Andrews in 2019, and an MSc in late antique Byzantine and Islamic Studies from the University of Edinburgh in 2020. I hope you will enjoy today's presentation. Now, please give a warm welcome to Ethan.
Thank you so much, Dimitris. I will be presenting on Theodoros Hyrtakenos, a minor writer of the Paleologan period, and the title of this presentation is The Works of Theodoros Hyrtakenos, Rhetorical Commentary and Authorial Self-Presentation in the Corpus of an Early Paleologan Man of Letters. This actually is quite an interesting picture just before we start. This is the first page of the manuscript, and the manuscript actually begins here. You can see the heading, which is of a rather naive style with foliate designs and cruciform symbols, and binding leaves taking from a set of hymns to the Theotokos, probably of a slightly earlier date than the manuscript itself. As an introduction to this author, it seems appropriate to begin with the facts of his life and the world in which he lived. He was born probably around 1260 in the village of Hyrtaki, near Cyzicus, in the hinterland of Cyzicus, in Bithynia. And he came of age in a world of small powers, in which the Empire of Nicaea had recently reconquered Constantinople, and in which its emperors attempted to foster a cultural flowering akin to that of their Comnenian predecessors. Ultimately, however, they were unable to do so due to the straitened circumstances of the Byzantine state at this time, and the ability of the emperors to call resources in order to support such scholarly activities. However, they were able to preside over a verdant but ultimately abortive cultural flowering, of which Hyrtakenos' work comprises a relatively minor part. Now, as an introduction to the manuscript, which is known as Parasinis Graecus 1209, and is kept in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, it consists of a collection of orations and letters, including an oration in honor of the Mother of God, an oration addressed to the emperor, 3 monodia concerning the funeral orations concerning the deaths, respectively, of Nikephoros Hymnos, a major intellectual of the period, Irene of Montferrat, an empress, and the heir apparent to the throne, Michael IX Palaiologos. As well, there is a hagiographical tract relating to the miracles of Saint Aninas of Bithynia, an ekphrasis of the Garden of Saint Anna in Bethlehem, and a collection of some 96 letters, and a short oration in honor of the Emperor Andronicos II, with which oration Hyrtakenos may in fact have attracted the patronage of this emperor. Most critically for this presentation, Parasinis Graecus 1209 represents both a codex unicus, a single manuscript preserving the works of this author without any other copies or recensions, as well as likely an autograph manuscript written in Hyrtakenos' own hand. Though this may seem relatively insignificant, it puts in perspective many of the self-presentational and rhetorical methods which permeate the text and which form an integral part of our study of Hyrtakenos' life and work. Now, the materiality of the manuscript is rather prosaic, but also rather interesting in the sense that it does have a bearing on the way in which we view his work, considering that it is in fact an autographed manuscript and therefore a very rare opportunity to understand an author in a holistic sense almost, or through an object in which every aspect of it was presumably mediated by the author himself. It consists of 164 vellum leaves, numbered in an early modern hand with an early modern table of contents at the beginning. Likewise, the vellum cover is likely early modern. However, the pages themselves and the manuscript as a whole is early 13th century or early 14th century, likely written in the late 1320s or early 1330s, depending on when we place the date of Hyrtakenos' death. He was certainly alive in 1328 upon the death of Nikephoros Hymnos, whose funeral oration, or one of whose funeral orations he was an author. It also it's written in a neat but somewhat stilted hand, and it contains a whole variety of emendations and marginal notes that will be the subject of the next section, as well as a series of headings as seen in the first slide. Now, the actual nature of the marginal notations in a work of this caliber, one in which is in both an autographed manuscript and a codex unicus, is the means by which they offer us a window potentially into the educational dimensions of this manuscript and the self-presentational manuscript and the self-presentational aspects of this manuscript through paratextual dimensions, by which I mean parts of the manuscript that do not comprise the main text. And what you see here on the screen is a chiastic diagram inserted into the margins on, I believe, leaf 13, in order to diagram and call attention to very sort of witty use of chiasmus in a retelling of the biblical story of the Israelites being led across the desert by a burning pillar of fire and of smoke. Moreover, the most basic marginal notations mark various proverbs, allusions to the biblical and classical canons, extractions from wisdom literature and the like, and consists of the abbreviations for the words, for the respective words, paroemia, historia, nome, and as well as several other terms such as genesis and thalma. But in terms of thalma, that is restricted to a particular section of the manuscript. Additionally, there are 4 emendations, which Caballero Sanchez has drawn attention to in her recent article, and which constitute effectively additions to the text or substitutions within the text that replace relatively commonplace words with more elevated equivalents. For example, the word skazde, to cut, is replaced with the word temne, which has a very similar or the same meaning. One of the greatest concentrations of marginal notes in the manuscript appears halfway through the oration upon the death of Michael IX, in which a whole series of metaphors are mapped in a way by placing the key words or the operative words of different images along the margins. So for example, in a passage which calls for the seasons to exchange the summer heat for ice and wintry frost, and for the natural world to wither in the manner of a tree at the close of autumn, in response to the death of the crown prince, we have in the margins the word theros for summer, and interestingly enough, later on, for the latter part of that metaphor, we have the word phenocoro, which means effectively in the manner of a tree at the close of autumn, or depending on the case, at the close of autumn. But in this case, it is dative and refers to this sort of extended metaphor. Other parts of the same set of heavily annotated text include a section dealing with personified virtues, including Andrea, courage, sophrosini, forethought, and others, mourning for the death of the crown prince, while also seeing their selfhoods, these virtues reflected in him. Interestingly enough, in the life of Saint Aninas and the discussion of his miracles, each miracle occurs with the word thalma, or marvel, or miracle, in the margin, as well as a number, or a numeral, which indicates a number, which itself suggests that this longer work is being broken down for ease of comprehension. Another very important piece of this are a series of words, such as the word genesis, the word anatrophe, and others, which occur next to different passages in an oration upon the Theotokos, the Mother of God, and these words have a particular overlap with different rhetorical terms which are used by Menander Rhetor in his Basilikos Logos and his discussion of the structure of an imperial oration in general. The primary question that these marginalia cause us to think about in light of the autograph nature of the manuscript is what purpose did they serve and why were they inserted? I would tentatively argue that they served an educational or quasi-educational function. In any sense, they certainly were intended to reveal to the reader and to posterity in general the rhetorical means by which Hyrtakenos communicated his ideas, composed his rhetorical arrangements, and indeed sought to present himself. Now, in the course of his manuscript, specifically his letter collection, which by its very nature differs from his orations in containing a much more direct and present authorial voice, Hyrtakenos seeks to project some four or more, but four primary rhetorical persona. The first of which concerns a rhetoric of poverty, which he effected in order to attract the largesse of patrons. In particular, he opined that he did not become a tradesman because their children have full bellies while he has to abide in his home at harvest time with a wine sack that is inhabited only by spiders in one anecdote, and in multiple anecdotes in which his horse is said to be so hungry that it has devoured his books and is in danger of turning on him. Furthermore, he discusses periods of starvation in which he is unable to properly stock his household. And these are the aspects of the manuscript that drew the comment of earlier Byzantinists mainly, including Krumbacher, who made a disparaging comment about Hyrtakenos and Gavras, labeling them Bettelprosiker, or begging poets. However, to properly read the rhetoric of poverty encoded in Hyrtakenos' writing, it's necessary that we understand the reasons for such displays of indigence on the part of the author. In the first place, one might argue that Paleologian Byzantium, with its small elite, attenuated resources, and bitter competition within that elite, that projecting a persona of poverty was necessary in order to ward off competition. Now, another very important piece of this persona that Hyrtakenos utilizes is one of social exclusion, in which he is turned away despite his educational despite his educational credentials and his purported connections from the circles of power. For example, the patriarch Ioannis Glikis sends him away from the gates of the patriarchal palace, where he is compelled to wait alongside beggars and various other petitioners. At other times, he mentions that the courtly and quite well connected parents of his students refused to pay him, and that's quite an important aspect of this that, unfortunately, I believe I skipped over in the first part of this, is that Hyrtakenos worked as a teacher for much of his life at a court school, probably affiliated, directly with the imperial court, but which certainly he had a series of very distinguished students, including Alexios Apokafkos, Konstantinos Loukites, and and Stavros who later on would marry into the imperial family at the behest of his father, the famous Mesazon, Theodoros Hyrtakenos, as well, who was also the patron of the famous Hora Church. Additionally, he attempts to project a rhetoric of poverty through by mentioning by making use of various other examples, including his inability to hold on to a set of volumes of Plato and Aristotle, which are required to be sold in order to attend to the needs of his household. However, a completely contradictory persona is projected by Hyrtakenos, one of gentility and elite status. In order to approach this, it may serve to return to the materiality of the manuscript itself. It's fairly long, and it's written entirely on vellum, which by this point had become a rather rare writing material in Byzantium, except for the most lavish manuscripts. And although it is a rather plain manuscript in terms of ornamentation, in terms of calligraphy, etc., the fact that Hyrtakenos both could afford to and wish to have his works copied on vellum is telling, and suggests that his insistence of poverty, social exclusion, and indigence is much more of a rhetorical topos than anything else. Another aspect of this that is interesting is his selection of contents. He definitely makes efforts to include letters to and orations concerning some of the most exalted figures within the imperial hierarchy, to whom he clearly wishes to advertise his connections. In several letters, furthermore, he implies that he does come from a rather prosperous background, albeit a provincial one, and several times attempts to become the pronoiar of several monasteries near Cyzicus, and evidently of several monasteries near Cyzicus, and attempts to, as well, to become a landed proprietor of an estate, which ultimately fails, and the failure of this estate is again used as an example of his poverty. However, the acquisition of any of these lands and titles in the first place would have been rather difficult had Hyrtakenos been as marginal as he claims. Moreover, in addition to these rural properties and these prospective pronoiaria that he attempted to acquire, he possessed numerous books. As we can tell from his letters, he possessed numerous books. A sizable house in Constantinople with an orchard and a separate stable, and presumably a household of servants that went along with such a establishment. Moreover, his tastes seem to have been very, 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 very expensive, because in a discussion with his former student Konstantinos Loukites, who is at this point the protovestiarios of the Empire of Trebizond, many hundred miles to the east, along the Black Sea coast, he requests a worldly black cowl lined with fox fur, as it's translated, or fashionable as one might translate the word cosmicon, and a high hat of stiffened felt, and a multicolored silk kaftan of Persian origin known as a kamkha. As well, he attempts to, in the same way that that extremely exalted figures in Byzantine society sought to undertake patronage as part of their engagement with society at large. Hyrtakenos himself acts as a patron in several letters and apparently had petitioners and dependents of his own. In this case, a poor doctor fleeing from the frontier called Barankatos, a certain monk who he intercedes on behalf of, so he might speak to the patriarchal secretary, and finally, a young woman whose husband has deserted her, and for whom means must be sought for her to support her children. Now, one of the critical parts, obviously, of the manuscript is Hyrtakenos' projection of his own learning, his own erudition, his own paideia, if you will. First of all, the very presence of these marginal notes and these very meticulous deconstructions of certain metaphors, certain sets of paragraphs, certain sentence structures suggest that not only were the marginal notes potentially served an educational purpose, whether within or outside of Hyrtakenos' school, but that they also served a self-presentational purpose. In fact, the very proliferation of the symbols which indicate classical and biblical allusions, as well as proverbs which would have been drawn from similar florilegia of antique texts, are almost always marked, which indicates that through this he wished to project his learning, as well as perhaps make the process of composition more legible to his students. Furthermore, in his famous oration addressed to Andronikos II, which likely is the earliest document in here and may or may not have been the piece that brought him to the attention of the court, he describes the formation of the world as a way in which to debunk the atomic theories of the ancient philosopher Democritus. And in the course of this divergence in the text, he uses vocabulary such as synkrima, systema, and several other words which have a almost natural philosophical or proto-scientific cast to them, which indicate a compound formed of multiple bodies. Indeed, his entire description of the creation of the world, which implicitly associates the Emperor Andronikos II with the demiurge, contains a whole variety of terms for the elements and for various other natural phenomena, which suggest that Hyrtakenos was taking advantage of and drawing inspiration from the intellectual climate at the court of Andronikos II, who, though conventionally pious and rather unworldly, was a great lover of learning and a great patron of it as well. Furthermore, in a series of letters, Hyrtakenos sets himself up as an arbiter of taste within the imperial capital, and as someone to whom those aspiring to a career in the imperial bureaucracy should apply. For example, in a letter to a certain noble Acarnanian, he admonishes the former for writing in a prosaic and unaffected style, which he contends would be inappropriate for the refined environs of the imperial capital, and for the world of the Constantinopolitan literati, with its ceremonious exchanges of belles lettres and other such documents. Finally, it is through his position as a teacher that Hyrtakenos gives force to his other rhetorical persona. And here on the page we have a picture of the place in which that very long metaphor about the change of seasons is elaborated upon. So you can see the line of terms along the side in the margins, and also the fact that they clearly are in the same hand. So if it is an autographed manuscript, which it almost certainly is, it also that the margin notes are also certainly in the same hand. So Hyrtakenos wished to present himself as a conscientious educator, and he did this in a very distinctive way. He included letters between himself and former students, particularly exalted ones, and the three that I will be discussing at this time are Alexios Apokafkos, who would later go on to become, an eminence grise in Byzantine politics in the middle of the century, but who came from quite a modest background. Niarchos who was the son of Theodoros Hyrtakenos, who was a major figure of the time, and who ultimately married, I believe, one of the nieces of Andronicos II, and Konstantinos Loukites, who would go on to become the protovestiarios of the Empire of Trebizond, and in many ways a significant power behind the throne in that state as well. And Hyrtakenos includes various letters, either referring to these personages or directly addressed to them, which serve to reflect positively back on him as their teacher. This is not immediately clear, especially in the discussion of Niarchos Metochites, where Hyrtakenos excoriates him to his father for his devotion to theatrical spectacles, riding, and sumptuous dress, while Alexios Apokafkos is portrayed as a model student. And yet both of them later on in the manuscript have become, according to his letters, have become accomplished and competent members of the imperial bureaucracy, which presumably would have been impossible without Hyrtakenos's not only intellectual but also moral guidance. Further, now the correspondence with Konstantinos Loukites is far more suggestive of the obligations owed by the student to the teacher, and vice versa as well, and the connections which such education confers upon those who take part in it. For example, most of the exchanges between Konstantinos Loukites and Theodoros Hyrtakenos concern the exchange of goods, and particularly the acquisition of goods either in Trebizond or Constantinople, which were unavailable in the other one respectively, as well as efforts to put give the other correspondent information about official positions and other sinecures that may or may not have been available in their respective fields. But for example, but in the case of many of his letters to Leucites, he draws upon his position as a former teacher in order to elicit gifts, favors, etc., from Leucites, and it is understood that this is not beyond the realm of reciprocity. That Hyrtakenos, as Leucites' teacher, and has imparted something to him that is valuable in quantifiable terms. Indeed, it is Leucites who is expected to furnish Hyrtakenos with the somewhat outlandish and very, very fashionable outfit, which he requests earlier in his letter collection. But this was not merely a one-way street. Leucites, presumably, also thought that Hyrtakenos was a worthwhile contact in the imperial capital and tasked him with acquiring myrrh, a copy of the Odyssey, fish roe, and various other commodities that were unavailable or prohibitively expensive in Trebizond. And ultimately, teaching is, his position as a teacher is what gives power to his other personae, in the sense of it isn't his poverty in itself that is supposed to garner pity or assistance. It's the fact that he is a teacher in poverty, that he is an integral part of the formation of the Byzantine bureaucratic elite, and this is borne out by a throwaway mention in one of his letters that approximately 3/4 of the imperial secretaries have been his students at one time or another. Furthermore, it is his position as a teacher and as a epidoumenos that makes his projections of elite status not crass, but appropriate for someone in his position. It's appropriate that he should live in some comfort. And furthermore, of course, it adds extra force to his to our sense of him as a scholar, that he's someone who's able to impart these things down the generations effectively. And if we are to judge by the careers of several of his students, he was quite successful. In conclusion, Theodoros Hyrtakenos is a fascinating and often overlooked figure of the Paleologan period, and a close reading of his work may provide a portrait of a minor Paleologan literatus in a period that is often dominated by such colossi as Theodore Metochites, Nikephoros Humnos, and Maximus Planudes, and others. Furthermore, what is most unique and most promising about Hyrtakenos' work is the way in which it allows us not only to study a manuscript, which represents a product of its author from beginning to end, but also to understand the ways in which text and paratext, or marginal notes, and other aspects of the manuscript came together in the service both of self-presentation and of the education of posterity. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a really rich presentation that, in my mind, already raises a whole number of questions to which I hope we can go. I would like to invite our audience, both here in this room, but also on Zoom, to submit questions on the question and answer box on your platform, and I'll try and collect them and read them as they as they can. And to kick things off, I would like to ask a question on how you imagine the manuscript working as a tool for self-representation. And what I mean by that is, who has access to that manuscript? How do you imagine the manuscript being circulating, being used in the circle of these three quarters of the bureaucrats who eventually become important individuals? Can you tell a bit more on that angle?
Now, I'm not entirely sure about how it was used, whether it actually was used directly, potentially as a teaching tool, or whether this was sort of I think it's more likely, given the expense of the text and the vellum, that this was a kind of a presentation copy of some kind perhaps for himself. But I think the way in which it might have circulated is that after his death, presumably either his students or another teacher would have used it as a text. But it's really, really hard to tell exactly for whom these explications in the margin meant. At the very least, it represents a way in which we, in the modern age, can see how he is engaging with and annotating the text. But exactly how it was meant to be circulated in his own time, I'm really not sure.
And the follow-up question on this tension between poverty and urbaneness, if you want, or access to power. Do you see any parallels in what Hyrtakenos is doing here and let's say Stavros or Stavros, 12th-century?
Absolutely.
Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yes, and I think that this is a very important piece that I unfortunately chose not to include in the PowerPoint. But following the reconquest of Constantinople, intellectual life in the capital begins to repair itself along recognizably 12th century lines, at least to my eyes. And I don't think that this is an accident, because it's almost an imperative for the Paleologoi to return the empire to its former state. And the last time that it was a cohesive state was during the Komnenian era. And furthermore, I think that that is the direct background from which these authors are drawing, is that of the 12th century and these Komnenian authors. So I actually think that in the case of someone like Tzitzis, Hyrtakenos may very well be purposefully placing themselves, in dialogue with Tzitzis and in kind of correspondence with Tzitzis in his work. I would say that Tzitzis seems to have been more often outside of this circle of patronage and working for himself, sort of, as far as I understand. Whereas this sense of Hyrtakenos's poverty may or may not be largely a rhetorical topos, because there's some work on the dating of the letters that's been done by Georgios Stavros, and it indicates that a lot of these letters complaining about lack of food, etc., take place during, I believe, 1314 is the year that Andronikos II burns all of the wheat fields in Thrace to starve out a band of Catalan mercenaries. So a lot of this stuff is overlapping with periods of general crisis, and I don't think it should be understood as his general situation. And I think that Tzitzis was very much, I mean, Tzitzis was in some ways a maverick. He was very sort of, you know, he seems to have had fairly rigid principles on some matters. So I think that Hyrtakenos was perfectly content to work within the system and reap the benefits thereof. But I think that there's absolutely, you know, a correspondence there. But I think in Tzitzis it's a little more autobiographical rather than rhetorical.
So I wanted to ask, are there any decorations in this manuscript?
Yes.
And if so, are they marginal? And if so, what's the connection, if you know, and if there is any, between these marginal decorations and the actual text?
Yeah.
And is there any analogy between these decorations and the scholia, the marginal notes you analyzed, and the text?
There are decorations. Every oration and then the collection of letters as a whole has a heading, which is a sort of, let me just go back to the first slide. So you can sort of see it, but up at the top there's a band of sort of foliate vine-like designs that's top of the cross, and those occur with each section. This is by far the one that's in the best case, place, and the only one with a cross. I mean, it's the beginning of the manuscript. And the exactness of line and the quality over all of these diminishes as it goes forward, and becomes more sort of just kind of scribbling. I mean, I think by the time you get to the letters, it's not actually a bar, it's just sort of two corbels at the middle. And I did actually look into seeing if there was any kind of correspondence between the ornateness of the heading or the placement of the heading and the book and the status of the book of the piece within the book and or the marginal notes. But I actually didn't really find any connection. It seems that whoever was doing it, maybe Hyrtakenos, maybe he hired someone to do these decorations, was getting tired by the end, and the quality was decreasing. But other than that, there doesn't seem to be a lot of correspondence. For example, there's no indication that one manuscript is considered particularly important because the decoration is particularly ornate. And I get the sense that this is something that was kind of programmatic decoration in the sense that this was kind of just a way in which, probably the cheapest option in terms of decoration. But he did clearly want decoration. And this is sort of the same situation with some of the capitals, which are totally, the capitals are totally there. So one might potentially say that this is sort of substituted for that, but I don't know. I really I couldn't figure out really exactly what the relationship between the marginal notes, the text, and the headings and the decoration would be. Although I'm sure that there would have been one, but it's difficult to extrapolate from the information.
Okay, thank you.
Yolanda?
I was curious, in the collection, do you only see letters that are from Theodoros, or do you see it from other people writing to it?
Only from. So it's a classic Byzantine letter collection where it's only from. So you don't get the responses, and you actually don't get it. For some people, you wonder whether he got a response. There's a lot of letters to the emperor, and one wonders if he got a response, or to various very important figures. But some of them appear to be part of exchanges, certainly. There's one in which he alludes to a lost work of his that is not included in this manuscript, which was an encomiastic poem of 120 lines upon, about a certain natural philosopher and what does he say? A natural philosopher and mathematician, but it's not entirely. But this doesn't survive.
Do we find any of his other works or letters in different collections?
No.
No, only
No,
here.
that's why it's so critical,
Right.
because I believe we don't have any other proof that he existed other than this. And we know his students. We know his students existed.
We don't have any of his letters with the students.
No, we don't have any responses from Niarchos Metropites or from Apokafkos. I mean, that's who he's most famous for, as being a teacher of Apokafkos, but we know that because he sent one letter to Apokafkos, which compared to, I think, about 13, 10 or 6, maybe, or 7 to Nikites, and
he has precise names of his addressees in the title as well.
well, some of them it's either about the person, so it's to Theodoros Hyrtakenos about his son in the one case, or it's to Niarchos Metropites, the blank, whatever position he was holding at that point. And a lot of the times it's, he doesn't have specific names for a lot of people. A lot of people, it's, a noble Acarnanian, a judge, and a lot of them are, you'll get one that's Toi Basileo, and then another, and then for the 6 letters after that are addressed to the emperor, you'll get Toi Adroit. So it's one of these things where sometimes you're getting various degrees of identification, and sometimes you get something like to the student Phocas. I mean, which doesn't really indicate who that is to any meaningful degree. And at other times you get to somebody's title, to the protovestiarios, to the this, to the that. So for some people, you kind of have to fill in prosopographical information, but for most of the very important figures, that's not an issue.
Okay, so to ask a question by one of our attendees online, it goes, is Hyrtakenos' treatise effectively a marketing tool, establishing his stature, endeavoring to interest patrons and parents of possible students, elevating himself above other scholars, basically branding himself? Had he not promoted himself in this way, what would his life have looked at? Is his self-representation unique among other teachers, scholars of the time?
His self-presentation certainly isn't unique, but what I think is unique is first of all his specific position and the connections that he has, and secondly, I don't think that this was exactly just because that's sort of what Karpazilos and Faturos argue in their recent edition of his letters, which is that this was effectively a branding tool. And I think if it was branding for posterity. It was memorializing, because it seems to have been written at the very end of his life, at the end of his career. It includes he presumably died sometime between 1328 and the mid 1330s. He doesn't make any mention of the Civil War or Andronikos III. And in fact, because there are leaves missing from the end of the manuscript, we don't know whether it's complete. So it could have been in progress at the time that he died, but it certainly was something that was compiled at the end of his life, looking back on his teaching career in retrospect, I think. And I think it had limited, weight. I think it had limited weight to bear on his teaching career as it existed, but I think as a device for posterity, and so posterity could sort of see, could understand who he was or analyze his sort of oratorical methods and skills. I think that's what it was largely intended for. Now that of course brings us to the question of who had this, how was it circulated, why was it circulated, and I have a broad guess that it was circulated, in sort of his circle, but exactly why or in what capacity, I'm not sure. But it certainly was considered important enough to be preserved. So that I think is telling, and preserved, interestingly, with no other marginality.
You'll have a follow-up from Giovanna, who has specific letter interests.
I'm sorry, this is the last one.
No, keep going.
Does it, by any chance, in the last couple of letters, let's say the last 10 letters of the collection that we have, do you find any letters of condolences or consolation letters or something like that?
No.
No. Okay.
No. And there doesn't even, yes, you assume that the ones that are later are later, but there's very little clear chronology. You kind of have, for some of this stuff, you kind of have to guess, like for example.
Sorry, I wasn't thinking chronologically, like by the end, like the last, maybe you said 94 letters are preserved.
96.
96, sorry. 96, so maybe in the last, I don't know, 90, in the last couple of letters that we find in the collection, we find any kind of stories of death or constellation letters or some kind of narration that deals with death and like sadness.
No, I think it ends actually on one of the about 16 letters that involve a permutation of the story of his horse eating his books and almost eating them. I think it ends in the middle of one of those. Or no, not in the middle. I think it ends on one of those, I believe. I'll have to check when I get home. But that's one of the reasons that maybe it's unfinished, because it doesn't seem to end on any particular note. And I also think it's interesting that he includes that anecdote literally in like a quarter of his letters, which is another potential idea that this might be educational, but they have this sort of set piece rhetorical episode, this vignette, that's then inserted into all kinds of letters and sort of with the same meaning effectively that he wants money and he,
So he's ending the collection being poor or describing his poverty.
I think so, but it might be something else. I think it's definitely not anything to do with death. And I think I remember reading it and thinking that it was a very strange place to stop because it was so prosaic. So I think that we may be missing, at least one or two letters. And I don't know, is that a property of epistolographic manuscripts?
Just something I'm thinking about from what I've seen in some, but yeah.
But no, we don't have anything like that. And in fact, we do have stuff like that obviously in the Monodia. But those come before come before the letters, and also presumably, seem to be in chronological order. I think it goes Michael IX, Irene of Montferrat, and then Niarchos. And actually, the Monodia on Niarchos is, the evidence that we have that he lived past, 1328. That's how we get a sense of his lifespan.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you addressed this a little bit in your talk, but I was wondering if you could expand on it and just sort of maybe think about what do you make of sort of the contradictory nature of this figure, and why do you think that he is presenting himself as a pauper, but also sort of, as you say, as a gentleman? Is it really just a rhetorical topos or something?
I mean, I don't think it's I don't think it's totally divorced from life, but I don't see it as so contradictory. Like I see these things as sort of attributes that are in tension, but that aren't contradictory, and it's almost as if one can have eugeneia and be in straitened circumstances, right? So but I think that the rhetorical topos of poverty is so present there. Because first of all, in a lot of these letters, he's trying to get funding, and study for something or another. And in the ones in which he is, is talking about his wealth, it's far less. It's much subtler. It's much subtler and kind of has to be extrapolated, but. The fact that he's exchanging the fruits of an orchard attached to his house with various, people sending pomegranates. It indicates that there is a space, a place, and I think that is sort of I got the sense that it was sort of like, I'm going to encode this subtly, and people who know will read this. And we'll see it. I think the other thing to note is that they don't exist. These things aren't put together side by side in an individual letter. So at different times, depending on who he was talking to, I'm sure that he wanted to emphasize one or another aspect of his sort of rhetorical persona.
Thank you.
So, any final questions? I don't see any questions from our online audience, and I will invite those who are here with us to join for some post-talk socializing and snacks and perhaps a drink. And I'm going to thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation and discussion. And want to basically, as we come to the end of this fall speaker series, wish everyone a very safe and restful holiday issue, and encourage everyone to stay tuned for upcoming spring semester series schedule. Also note that if you have been unable to follow our speaker series this past fall, time conflicts or other circumstances, we do have the talks available on our YouTube channel, and you can always subscribe to our newsletter to receive latest news and updates on what is happening at the SNF Center. Once again, thank you so much for being with us, and see you with the new year.
Thank you very much, everyone.